Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Daydream Nation, and I've got Todd Evans back to the channel. How are you going?
Very good. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Absolutely.
Very
Today
excited.
we are going to do a show on this epic album, George Harrison, All Things Must Pass.
And as you
So,
can see, mine looks like what a copy of All Things Must Pass usually looks like. It's all coming apart and
this epic George Harrison album, I wanted to get Todd over to talk about the tracks, to talk about how he thinks it fits within the Beatles solo discography, and just shoot the breeze about this epic album, George Harrison. So, as I normally start the show off, Todd, what was your recollection of listening to these tracks or, this album in the day, if any?
okay, well, I have to admit something. I mean, I have to be honest, but that it also sets me up to look like I missed the boat. I'd never listened to this album back in the day. I just knew the singles. I just knew What Is Life and My Sweet Lord. I This is one of those things. I looked at it and I thought, there's three records in it, and it looks like this, and he looks like a very sad rural man. And I thought, I don't think this is for me, and I skipped it. Now that was a mistake, but I just wanted to be honest about that. This is an album I've heard songs, but I've never listened to it all the way through. So
Yeah,
until about a month ago.
in the day, my recollection, like in the 70s, was My Sweet Lord, Wawa, What Is Life, the hit singles, because they were in the 70s up to the early 70s. This was played on radio a lot. This was a big hit. And
Yeah.
also had the recollection of the lawsuit, which I'm sure we'll go into, about the plagiarism with My Sweet Lord. That got a fair amount of press. My actual encounter with the album was probably 10 years ago when I think they did a remastering or a reissue. It's been in my collection ever since. And I picked up the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, which
Okay.
has got about, 5 or 6 discs.
I
Loving
actually
it.
have mine on loan from the
Yeah.
local record store, and I don't think I'm going to keep it because I think I'm going to either hold out for a better one or buy a new one.
So, and also, like, I guess I've got to be out there. I'm a Beatles tragic. They're my favorite band of all time. You're a Beatles fan, Todd?
I am, yeah. And it's very interesting doing research about this album because one of the opinions that was very popular at this time was that Paul and John didn't give they passed on too much of George's material. And there are some people who would go so far as to say that George has the strongest material. Those two just never let him get any songs on the album. Now, when I hear that outside of listening to this album, I think that's a bunch of nonsense. But when you listen to this album, it didn't convert me to thinking that way, but it made me more sympathetic to the fact that there are George Harrison songs on Beatles albums that I don't like. There are ones that I think are great, but there are ones that I don't like. And so prior to listening to George's earlier albums, I started thinking, oh, okay, well, there's some really good Beatles songs that didn't get to be Beatles songs. So
Yeah.
I didn't come away thinking, oh, they're right. George is the best songwriter, but I came away thinking he was better at the time of the Beatles than I thought he was.
It does. It makes totally sense. I think Harrison's my favorite Beatle. I've
Yeah.
always liked his sort of offbeat spiritual approach, and
Yeah, see,
I
I
just,
I don't care for those as much.
mm,
I don't hate them, but I don't care for those as much. I don't like Long, Long, Long,
yeah.
and I feel like he probably had better things, but for whatever reason, I think Paul and George wanted him to use that one. He probably had things that I would have liked better. I don't want to say better songs, but
Yeah.
songs that I
Something,
would have liked better.
something's probably top five Beatles.
Something is
That
absolutely,
is. I
and
mean,
Taxman.
when you've got Frank Sinatra saying, and he was very adverse to pop music, saying that's
Right.
one of the greatest songs of the 20th century.
Yes.
I've got to agree with Frank. But this album is like an explosion. It's like this guy has been stockpiling all these songs, putting his arm around it, and it's like oh, all in one album or a couple of discs. It's just
Well,
like,
it's interesting. I read that the people that he didn't think that all of them would make the album, and the people at Apple said, "No, you got to use all of them." I don't think that would have been my advice. And people say that a lot, and then I realize this is heresy to a lot of people because I know how people love this album. Mike Portnoy loves this album, and so I don't want to make any enemies here, but I think I would have trimmed this record. I think it would have been
yeah.
amazing.
Mm,
I think it would have been even bigger than it was. I mean, think about this. He got as many people as he did to buy this big old thing. It was expensive and difficult for retailers to carry.
yeah,
Retailers were skeptical because it looked like a classical album. And
yeah,
I mean, it was an uphill battle.
yeah. Well, there is a school of thought that this is the greatest Beatles solo album, and I'm one of those people that sort of subscribe to that. There's a channel that Todd and I belong to called the Contrarians, and a couple of years ago they did pick your favorite Beatles solo album. And interesting, we had a panel of about six
Did I
people or
do
seven.
that?
Sure, you may have been on that. I'm not
I
sure,
think
but
I did.
check it out,
I'm trying to remember
folks.
what I picked.
Check it out, folks. I'll put the link. And this album came up the winner out of all of them. McCartney, Starr, Lennon. This was picked about 3 or 4 times that the folks would be putting up this album. So it has resonated with a lot of folk, and it did fabulously well in the charts, number ones. And it was probably off the back of the song My Sweet Lord. So just to get things going and then talk spotlighting songs, do you mind if we talk about My Sweet Lord?
Sure.
Okay,
Sure. Yeah.
over to you. What do you
Oh, I was gonna. Can you lead that one because that's not one of the songs that I picked to highlight.
All right, I'll lead with it. I like the spirituality. I love the lyrics, even though it does sort of highlight "He's So Fine," and that was subject to a lawsuit. I just think that it's just got so much beauty. It's sort of like referencing a melody from that previous song, and may heard it or may not have, but he's embellishing it in the George Harrison world and adding that wall of sound and adds more flavor to it. What do you think, Tom?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think is great about this song is that it it pushed him a little bit towards the older generation because even if people weren't thinking of it being as spiritual and as the way that George thinks of it as being spiritual. I mean, he mentions Hare Krishna in it. And so, he's definitely not talking about mainstream conservative Christianity in the United
Mm,
States for sure.
yeah,
But there were people who that was their thing, who liked this song because of its spirituality. And I think that was a really smart thing to do. He talked about his own spirituality, but he called it My Sweet Lord, which is very easy for people who are of all different kind of religions to relate to. And I think that was super smart. I don't know whether he planned it to be something that was multi-generational, but that's kind of what happened. And my mother, who didn't listen to the Beatles, liked this song
yeah. I think
because of the
my
sentiment.
parents liked that as well, and they
And
were
she didn't know
very
what a Hare Krishna was.
yeah.
So
But there's a kind of melancholy in it. To me, the concert for George. I don't know if you've seen that, where you had it was like the All Star tribute. This was one of the most stirring, emotional songs on the whole concert, and I don't know. There's just a lot of emotional sweep and gravitas in this song, and I think what he's saying is, you may have your God and your religion, but you know we're all the same people. We're all human beings, and it's kind of centered like that. this album is very much about the spiritual side of George Harrison, which I think he was suppressing, and that made him quite angry. And it's evident when you look at the Let It Be movie, where you see that there's a lot of resentment, and he kind of checks out and disappears for a little period of time because he
Yeah.
didn't think he was getting the sort of airing of his songs that he sort of thought he deserved.
Well,
But
it's so weird when you think of the story of the Beatles and you think about how short of a time that was.
mm,
If that whole Beatles timeline hadn't been shrunk into so few years, they probably could have talked that out. But I
yeah,
mean, that happened at the end.
yeah,
So there were all these other things that were happening that were causing the band to
mm,
implode. But I think that that could have got fixed if
mm,
there wasn't all these other things, competing to
absolutely,
try to end that band. And there's a story about how John and Yoko showed up at the studio while he was making this album, and he sort of looks at him like, "What are you doing here?" And I guess they performed some hand claps on one of the songs, but on one of the Apple Jam songs. But I don't think that given time to really process this, I'm speculating here, but John and Paul probably would have had a little meeting and gone, "Hey, you know what? We have got to make an effort to really listen to George's demos and see if we can put a few in." But the band was already ending by that point.
yeah, it was.
I don't claim to be a Beatles scholar, so if I've got that wrong, please let me know in the comments. But I feel like if they had more time that they could have fixed that.
Yeah, I think hindsight's a wonderful thing, and
Right.
I'm not sure that the Beatles would have been the same band in the 70s as they were up to 1969. So I think that it's even though it may have ended not the way that they would liked it to have ended, it did preserve the legacy because you wouldn't want them to be something subpar or an imitation of what they
Right.
once were
And there's no
in the
precedent
60s.
before that. Bands just didn't
No,
last that long. Rock bands, pop
no.
bands,
And
they didn't last that long.
there's
It's
been
kind
so
of
many.
like it's kind of like Elvis going to Vegas. And that was because there was no precedent for a pop rock superstar having a long career. Elvis could have kept being cool until he died, but there was no blueprint. Nobody had done
Yeah,
it that long. And it's kind of the same way with the Beatles. They got to 7, 8, 9 years in, and they were like, how long can this go?
yeah. It's a wonderful what if. What if Elvis
Yeah.
was still around? Would he be playing the local clubs, or would he have been a mega star?
Would he have pulled the Johnny Cash and gotten a really hot producer and become
Rick
cool
Ru-
again?
Rick Rubin. Yeah,
He certainly could have.
absolutely. But look, My Sweet Lord is the emotional center. This is the commercial kickoff for this album. It's got this spiritual gravitas. Look, I'm looking at the chart action and it's 11111 all the way through. It really chimed
Right.
in. But whether there was plagiarism or there was just something that was in the back of his head that reflected that earlier song. It
Well,
it
I'm
was
very
ear candy, wasn't
opinionated
it?
on this topic. I'll just say that right up front. I don't think that anybody should ever sue anyone for that reason, because I don't think that anybody does it on purpose.
Mm,
Not when you think of all the high profile ones, probably the closest thing you get to people doing it on purpose is Led Zeppelin doing it. But
mm, yeah,
but I mean, I think about that. I think all the time about, is it Joe Satriani who sued Coldplay? And I think is that right? It's Joe Satriani. It's not Steve Vai. I think it's Joe Satriani.
yep,
And I think to myself, Joe Satriani wrote Viva La Vida in his dreams. I do not hear that at all. And this particular case with My Sweet Lord is a little bit easier to get, but I
mm,
really don't think that that's what George did.
yeah,
I just don't believe it.
yeah. Well, there was a financial cost to him, and I think an emotional cost.
Yeah,
And
I think so too.
you just look at some of the recordings of George around that era, and there was a little bit of darkness.
Hmm.
And I did think that sort of lingered with him for the rest of his life, but it shouldn't be because on its own, this is a standalone classic song. I really, really enjoy it. So,
Yeah.
What's the next song that you'd like to
Well,
focus on?
I want to talk about "Isn't It a Pity," which is funny. It's the longest, most epic song. So of course the prog fan is going to talk about it. But I that's the song when I first played the album all the way through that really made an impression on me. It sounds very 1970s. It sounds very early 70s to me, but absolutely not in a negative way. And I can't really put my finger on why that is. It could be the way the chord progressions are. There's something, or the the production or the arrangements, but there's something about it that sounds very early 70s to me. It's sad and it's kind of dark. It's got a very simple melody, but the melody's really memorable. Doesn't take long to learn. It's the perfect song for George's slide guitar. It's absolutely tailor made for that, and the solo is a highlight of it. It vamps the end, the chorus over and over for a very long time, and for a while, I was thinking my main criticism of this song was that it's too long, but I've eased up a little on that. I'm starting to think that I sort of get why it's as long as it is. And I think that out of all the songs on the album, it's the song that sounds the most like it could have been a Beatles song. It's got a very similar kind of string arrangement.
Yeah, it's a
And
beautiful.
without George Martin, too.
Yeah, it's a beautiful song. Beautiful. I think this is top tier Harrison on this album,
Yeah.
and I love his guitar work. There's something about a guitarist, Todd, that if you close your eyes and you hear it and you know who the person is behind, they've done the job. And you cannot mistake a George Harrison slide or a guitar riff. It's just got
Yeah.
that distinctive style. It's that little picking and that little bit of vibrato. It's just
Hmm.
wonderful. And all the way, his guitar work is sublime. I know there's superstar players on this album. I mean, if you look at the list of players, it's like the all stars. You've got Eric
Yeah.
Clapton, etc., and co. Harrison shines on this album, and I think the ability of the producer in putting the spotlight on George with all these people wrapped around him is a masterstroke. Because you have
Yeah.
got the Phil Spector wall of sound where you're listening to it and it's so dense. You can hear something behind something, behind something, behind
Right.
something. It's like you're in the forest and you're trying to, you know, but the
And
spotlight's
that
on him.
that sort of becomes an issue because the production does cover up some details. And there's a song I'm going to talk about later where you can hear a really intricate guitar part in it, and it's one of the songs that's less Phil Spectorized than the rest. And so it's like,
Yeah.
oh, if more of them were like that, imagine how
Yep.
much more you'd hear.
Yeah. Isn't It a Pity makes me sad? And that's good.
Yeah,
It's
I think
so
it's supposed to.
melancholy and it's just at his most emotional raw. And, you know, for somebody who's the quiet Beatle, and I think it was one of those guys that expressed himself through music. There are certain artists that you read interviews or you listen to them. They're very quiet, they're very introverted, but he expressed himself through music and wonderfully he did it through it. Isn't It a Pity?
Another thing about this album is that apparently he was so used to people like Paul telling him exactly how to play things that he didn't do that. And so everybody who apparently most of the people who participated in these sessions went away with a really good feeling about having a really great time and feeling respected because he never did that. He never told anybody how to play anything. It just came out how it came out. Now, I happen to think that people like Paul McCartney and like John Anderson and like Dennis DeYoung, who like to tell people exactly how to play, can be a very good thing. I say
Yeah,
that as a big fan of Paul McCartney. But I
yeah,
think in this particular case, the fact that Harrison didn't do that was a real smart idea.
yeah, absolutely. And
And you can feel it. You can feel the good vibes from it.
but I think this album, there's just so much joy, exuberance. He's just like a kid in a candy store. He's like, he feels like he's free. The burden of the Beatles, Beatlemania, because he hated Beatlemania. You read his
Yeah.
book, and it's like this weight off his shoulders, and that's why it just comes out in spades in this particular album. But that is a great song. It's one of my favorite songs of this album, but it's so damn sad.
Yeah.
And I think it's the guitar line. It's sort of just leads into this end climax, and yeah, I love it. I think it's a really really good song. All right, Hear Me Lord. So this is the one I love the harmonies, and the person I want to spotlight is Billy Preston.
Yeah.
Billy Preston is the circuit breaker in everything in a good way. He was the circuit breaker that in a positive way for the Let It Be sessions. And I love his keyboard work. You can hear it. It just shines. It's like a ray of light. So if you were looking at a video of the making of this album, it'd be like a spotlight on Billy and he'd be smiling, and it just
Right.
draws everyone emotionally into this. And I wrote also the band. It has that band feel, the last waltz, Hear
Yeah.
Me Lord. And there's a lot of soul, there's a lot of gospel. This is the most gospel soul album that any of the Beatles, I think, have ever touched. I mean, they've flirted with it. McCartney's flirted with that sort of style of music. Lennon has, but this is definitely the most soulful gospel R&B flavored album out of all the Beatles catalog. What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. I actually think that had the Beatles not broken up and had they moved into the 70s, that Billy Preston, if not being the fifth Beatle, which I know it's controversial to say that, would have been a presence for at least a few years. Because I think they really enjoyed his influence and the flavor that he
Absolutely.
puts
He he would
on
have
the
been an
track.
unofficial member like the Stones. You know how they've got a
Yeah,
rolling crew like Bobby Keys on sax and things like that.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. What's your next one?
Well, I'm going to pick another obvious one. What is Life? Um, I have always been familiar with the song and have always liked it. There's a great cover version by Neil Morrison and Mike Portnoy on their covers album, which is very enjoyable. And the song is really accessible. It almost sounds like a commercial jingle. It's perfect for AM radio, absolutely perfect. Um, I think it's a really accomplished composition, and musically, it's probably the best song on the album. Maybe not my favorite song on the album, but as far as being a product for the time and something to move units, it accomplishes that. It gets better for me every time I hear it. I think, like a lot of the songs on the album, it would have been even better with some crisper, more focused production. It's got interestingly enough, it's got strings and horns, but it doesn't really sound symphonic. It sounds like, a rock song with strings and horns on it. So it doesn't really push it into a long and winding road kind of a direction, which I love that song, but I know a lot of people don't care for the strings. But in this song, that's there, but that doesn't happen to it. It stays lighthearted and it stays really positive.
Yeah. I love this song, and I love the production of Phil Spector, the Wall of Sound. I think this is one of Phil Spector's greatest productions, but a lot of folk may disagree.
I
This
think it
song,
works. I wouldn't have wanted Harrison to do that forever, but
mm,
in this case, I think it works. There are times when I feel like I would love to hear some more definition in the mix, and there are times I'll talk about it when I bring up the next song where I feel like maybe there's too much going on.
yeah,
But
a lot.
that's not the norm. That's just in spots.
I love that little Baroque horn arrangements in this song. Kind of, like
Yeah.
McCartney used to do flirtations with classical Baroque horn arrangements like Penny Lane.
Mhm.
In this song, it has that little
Yeah.
bit. Jim Price on trumpet and Bobby Keys on saxophone.
Hmm.
I love that. That adds a lot of oomph to this particular song,
Yeah.
and the drumming. Jim Gordon on drums. He's the constant drummer all the way through. He's a powerhouse. It's kind of got that really echoey. It's like in an echo chamber, but it just adds so much it's like widescreen sort of sound. This was number one in Australia and hit number 10 in the US. So surprised it didn't go to number one, but it got a lot of radio airplay.
I
Um,
remember it like it did better. I mean, nothing number 10's nothing to sneeze at, but I
yeah,
remember it being extremely popular. I
yeah,
had the 45 when I was a kid of Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, which I absolutely loved, which
yeah,
came out after this. So that sort of tells you that I was discovering George Harrison about a year after this came out. So that's part of why I
absolutely,
missed it, is because I was a kid.
absolutely. ONJ, Olivia Newton-John, also covered this, and this did a very tidy
Yep.
number 16 in the UK and US. And she has followed a few of Georgie Harrison's numbers. I'll talk about one
Mhm.
very shortly. But yeah, but yeah, I think this is a great song. And you're right; it just pops out of the speakers. A lot of
I don't
these
think
songs,
anybody doesn't like it.
it's just so positive and uplifting, and it's made for AM radio. All right.
Mhm.
What's your next? Oh, that's mine. My next one
Yeah.
is Beware of Darkness.
Oh, okay.
I think it's delicate. It's got this delicate beauty. I described it like the sun going down. It's like sunset. And there's so much soul in his voice. Um, I think George Harrison, he has got the biggest range. He doesn't have the range of Paul McCartney, but there's a lot of soul in his voice. Maybe he's got a limited vocal range, but there's soul, and you can really feel the emotion. And I love that within between the verse and the chorus, there's all these little crescendos, and it's the sweep of the arrangement. Whether it's Phil Spector helping George or it's George. Yeah, I just think this is one of the most beautiful songs, and there's a lot of beautiful ballads on this album, but I think it's an extraordinary song. What do you think of this
Yeah,
one?
a lot of people like this track. It's, I mean, speaking of cover versions, Spock's Beard, the prog giant featuring Neil Morse. Not only did they cover it and make it the lead off track on this album, but they named the album after it. I think it's I think at that point in their career, it was their only cover that they did. And I went for years not even knowing, because I wasn't familiar with this album, that that was a George Harrison song, which is kind of embarrassing if you think about it. But obviously, this song is well thought of by a lot of other musicians.
Yeah. What do you think of the track listing on this album? Because there's a lot of there's a lot of great songs, but you've got to go deep in. How do you think it
Yeah,
runs?
I think it runs okay. And this may change as I spend more time with it, but I feel like side four is the weakest side, which is I hate to use the word weak, but I feel I feel like there are a couple of songs that like I said before could have been cut. Uh, I'm not going to name them yet because I don't know which songs you're going to pick, and you don't know what songs I'm going to pick. But I think that there are a couple that don't do a whole lot for me. But I don't think it could have been sequenced any better. I think what leads off each side and what ends each side is the perfect tracks for that. I kind of don't really care for I Dig Love, but it's got to go somewhere. So, but yeah, I mean, as far as having especially the way the sides end, isn't it a pity? Run of the mill, all things must pass, and hear me, Lord. I think those are definitely the best last track on each side.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, mate. What's your next song that you want to
So
spotlight
I want
on?
to talk about Let It Down. Um, that song to me, the intro has a very epic sound to it, almost prog rock. It almost sounds like Rockestra from later on in Paul McCartney and Wings, where you've got, quite honestly, too many people playing at once. I don't say that to cut this song down. I think it sounds cool, but that's what it sounds like to me. The verses have a really interesting and unique chord structure. It sounds really sophisticated and almost kind of like easy listening music in a way, but not in a bad way. Uh, it shows him as a very skillful composer, and again, the slide guitar fits perfectly. and the chorus rocks considerably harder than the verses, which I think is a really cool combination because it kind of bounces back and forth. And I also really like the organ on it. Is that Billy Preston on this track? Do you know? Can you?
Gary Brooker.
Oh, okay.
Gary
Well,
Gary
there you
Brooker
go.
plays keys on this, and I love Procol Harum, and I've always
Yeah, me
loved Gary
too.
Brooker, and it's class.
But I love the organ part in this song because it's almost the same note sustaining for a very long time, and it doesn't change very much. So when it does, you notice it, and I always think that's a really cool technique. So I like
Yeah.
Let It Down a lot. It stood out to me as
Yeah,
one of my
I
faves.
call it the All Star Jam, and
What it sounds like.
it's an All Star Jam, and I love it. And it's very dense. This is the one where
Hmm.
I was saying earlier, where Spectre, you're listening to it in the headphones, and you can hear an instrument behind an instrument, an arrangement behind an arrangement. There's a lot
I don't think he
happening.
really could have done it any other way. I don't think you
Yeah,
could have streamlined it.
yeah,
I think it needs to be done that way.
yeah. But one thing I really want to spotlight on this song is the little slide licks of Harrison. Beautiful. His guitar playing is sublime on this album, but he really is just having so much fun, and he's
Yeah.
just weaving his slide guitar licks in and out of it. It's interesting about the song title called "Let It Down" because John had "Don't Let Me Down" and Paul had "I'm Down," and I think Ringo had another down song. So
He did.
I
I
think
can't
they're all.
remember it now.
I better write a song called "Down" as well. So yeah, if you get the bonus of this, and I think there's even a bigger box set. There's like an all-star jam, and it just goes on and on. And to me, it's very much of the time with the Allman Brothers where they had the jam rock.
Well, are you talking about the third disc on the original album, the
Yeah,
Apple Jam? Is that what you mean?
I'm even talking about what
You
I've
talking about
heard
even
with
extra
the
jams? Okay.
yeah, it's sort of like with the 50th anniversary, there was even more material or sort of
Yeah.
demos and offcuts and rehearsals, and it was just like let's just go for it. And it was very much of that time in the early 70s where, the Allman Brothers and that sort of let's put on a show, and it's all musicology, just jamming, and I think George Harrison had that approach that let's just make it loose. Whatever happens, let's not, there's
Hmm.
certain songs where it's not structured, but if it sounds right, let it go. Let it put it put it down. And then the producer can weave his magic in between. All right.
Yep.
I'm going to put a song that you didn't like as much, but I I dig love. So I don't mind that. It what I like is he's got his voice very close to the mic, very raw, very
Mhm.
emotional. And I sort of said this reminds me of John Lennon a little bit, where he's going through his primal scream, that early John Lennon solo material. Um, there's a bit of a humor that runs through George Harrison in this album. It's not all serious and spiritual, but there's a little bit of dark humor where he's not taking things so serious. And I love the lyric, I dig love morning and evening. And you've got the staccato piano. I can imagine
Yeah.
Paul, if he was in there, he'd be doing the, staccato piano chords. And then there's, the scale up and the scale down. I think it's a kind of a funny track. I find this humorous. And
It does have it has more space in it than most of the other tracks as
yeah,
far as being a much less dense production.
palate
And I
cleanser.
think I think you're right. You make a really good point. And I think that would be a point against trimming it down to a single album is that you would have lost some of the humor.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And this one, I say, I dig love. I think it's kind of tongue in cheek because he's being a
yeah.
little bit of a Lafaro here. He goes, I dig love, morning, noon, and night. You know what I mean? It's just,
Yeah.
yeah. But he's
Yeah,
got
no, I see that.
but he's putting a John Lennon voice. I'm just wondering if he's saying, okay, this is to you,
It's almost
John.
like there's a little of John and Paul in this track.
Yeah. Do you think there's a little bit of when he was recording it, it was like, this one's for you, Paul. This one's for you, John.
Maybe.
A little bit of, throwing a rock there.
Well, the name of it, I Dig Love, sounds like it would be the name of a John song to me.
All
But
things must pass. Shake it off.
uh-huh.
I'll just let all the negativity just like that.
Yep.
All right, what's your next one?
The next one is I will attempt to explain why this one stood out to me. I'm guessing that it doesn't stand out to a lot of people. Run of the Mill. Uh, and I'll get in a minute. You'll know why I gravitate towards this one. But the acoustic guitar intro is very charming. It hooked me right from the start. It's got a really unique brass arrangement, the fantastic melody in the verses that really sound Beatlesque to me. But I think the thing that I love about it is the mixed meter. It sounds to me like it's in 4/4, but then there's a measure of six followed by a measure of three, and then it goes back to four. Now, that could be some other, I may have that wrong. That could be some other combination of those numbers, but but that adds up to the same number. But that's what I hear, and it's cool. And it took me a while to figure out that what was going on. I mean, I was drawn to the song, but then I started counting it out. And I was going, oh, that's interesting. That's complicated. I like that because it seems like it's kind of a one of the lighter songs, but it's actually there's a lot musically happening in it for a song as short as it is. So
That,
yeah, Run of the Mill stands out for me.
yeah, that's a really good pick. And when you listen to the rehearsals or the demos, some of the songs were faster or slower. I think they did it at different tempos or different time signatures just to see which one lands better. I'm not sure if George was the sort of guy that would get the paper out and write music. It was just you jam it
Yeah,
and it
probably
comes
not,
out
but
like that. You know what I mean?
yeah.
But no, that's a really good pick. Awaiting on you all, gospel
Yeah,
celebration.
I almost picked that as one of the ones I wanted to feature. Yeah,
That's the
that's
most
pretty
gospel
cool.
sounding. It's like a celebration. It's
Yeah.
this is where the wall of sound is just 5 star. It really hits the sweet spot. And you've got Harrison and Clapton. Harrison's like right at the front, doing these little slide guitar swooping in and out. And you can hear Clapton with his Wawa or like right in the back.
hmm
So
Yeah.
they're doing little trade-offs. So, and Jim Gordon on drums. So, no, I love that. You got anything to add on that one?
No, not really. That is one of those songs where it's like you could feel the joy in that one. You can feel like that one is just it's really there just to make you feel good.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you pick Wawa?
I did not. I considered it and crossed it out in my notes here.
Yeah,
I didn't. My initial impression of Wawa was that it was too long. And I still think it kind of is too long for what it is. But it's it annoyed me the first time I listened to it, and then with each subsequent listen, it kind of won me over. So
yes, yes. And the humor comes out. It's sort of
yeah.
like, it's got a sort of like a tongue-in-cheek humor. All I'm hearing is wah, wah.
Uh-huh.
And folks, this album is like sort of a time capsule of what was in George's head, how he was feeling. It's looking back, but it's also looking forward. So all the issues that he was having,
And it
and
doesn't come across as mean.
yeah,
It
and it
doesn't come
comes
across as
across in
mean.
this,
Yeah.
and it comes across in this song. So
Yeah.
got another one?
I do. I have All Things Must Pass.
Lovely.
Probably, and it's after I already said what I said about Isn't It a Pity? I think All Things Must Pass might be the most beautiful thing on the album. It's very beautiful. A little bit cleaner mix than some of the other songs. It's got some. That's the one I was talking about earlier, where there's some cool little electric guitar picking that's part of the arrangement, not a solo, but part of the arrangement that you can hear it really well because there's not quite so many other things going on at the same time. There's more space in the mix, and it's beautifully sung. It's really beautifully sung. So I'm not going to say the word beautiful anymore. I just that's
Yeah.
probably enough times, but that's the word that I think of when I think of All Things Must Pass. And to think that that could have been a Beatles song and was passed over.
Yeah, it's totally a head scratch, but maybe it's how the demo was presented because
Sure. Yeah.
the demo may have been so rough and so, like the original
Yep.
Genesis, they just couldn't hear it. But
Yeah. And
do you think it
we
was a
weren't
case
we
that,
weren't in the room, so
do you think John and Paul were just so self-obsessed that they just didn't give it enough bandwidth?
I don't know. I have some very strong opinions about that kind of thing. I really feel like it's very strange because I feel like in the Beatles that Paul McCartney is really the trailblazer. And I really feel like he should have had the freedom to do whatever he wanted. And the songs that Paul McCartney did that John Lennon complained about and said they were grandma music, those are like my favorite Beatles songs. Like I love Maxwell's Silver Hammer, and I love all of those songs that John was like, "Oh my God, it's another one of Paul's front parlor songs," I think he called them. And so I kind of feel like Paul was the one that should have had the most freedom. But at the same time, I don't know. It's funny how a band like the Beatles, you can listen to them all your life and your opinions just continuously evolve. I find that that's what's happening to me.
I think Paul has been critically reappraised because there was a long period of time that he was copping a lot of stick, especially in
Yeah.
the 80s.
uh, After what I just said about Paul being the one that I thought was doing the best work in the Beatles, his solo career, to me, this may be unpopular opinion, maybe contrarian, but to me, his solo career, I don't think I don't think those records were really, really good until Band on the Run. I think I like McCartney. I like
Ooh,
parts of Ram. I know a lot of people are really love Ram. I think that Uncle Albert has Admiral Halsey is genius, but there are parts of Ram that I think sound like they were not quite done. I think Wildlife is terrible. I think I would say the same thing about what Red Rose Speedway if it wasn't for my love. And
yeah,
then to me, this is just my opinion. Band on the Run comes out and it just takes off from there. Um, I I don't know if this is something that you were going to bring up later, but when you look at this album, All Things Must Pass, and you look at McCartney, which came out in 1970, and Plastic Ono Band, which came out in 1970, I think uh, All Things Must Pass is the best of those three.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
I
But
think it's better than McCartney, and I think it's way better than Plastic Ono Band.
yeah,
I am not a fan of that record.
yeah. Well, I think McCartney, the first album was mighty strong. I really like that album, but I don't. You don't have many arguments. But it's amazing. Like, yeah, McCartney. I think he has had a critical reappraisal of his solo career because critically, a lot of the cool for school folk, like of your NME magazines and the Melody Makers, were really putting a lot of crap on Paul in his 80s work. But I think he's outlasted a lot of folk, and a lot of people are
Well,
looking back at Wings, especially much more
yeah.
sympathetically and favorably, and justifiably so.
If I'm ever going to stand on a soapbox, it's going to be this one. And I was standing on this soapbox in the 80s. I used to, and it's really funny for me to actually say this again because it's funny to think of this age as being old. But I
Yeah.
used to say when after Pipes of Peace came out, which I thought was just a masterpiece, and they were saying that he had too many ballads and all that stuff, I was thinking, first of all, ballads is the thing that he does the best. And I used to say this, let 45-year-old Paul McCartney be 45-year-old Paul McCartney. They were all trying to pull him back in like a rawer, rougher kind of a, thing. And that affected him. And I think that that's why he made some of the records that he did or some of the tracks that he did that were a little bit more meat and potatoes rock and roll. And it sort of pushed him. I would have rather have seen him evolve from those 80s albums into what he would have evolved in naturally instead of feeling like he was succumbing to the pressure of trying to be more of a rock and roll guy. And I think some of that stuff doesn't work for me. That Russian album doesn't work for me. And I
Yeah.
think that that was a direct response to the
Yeah.
criticism that he was getting. And I don't think he deserved
I
that
agree.
criticism.
I agree. even though the playing on that Russian album's beautiful.
Oh yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
it's not terrible. It's just not what I wanted him to do.
absolutely. I'm going to talk a little bit just while we're on the topic of how the solo albums went about George Harrison. I don't think he ever hit the artistic heights of this album. So I think there was a kind of a decline through the 70s. I think his subsequent albums, they had moments of brilliance. I would describe his albums kind of patchy, where there were
Yeah.
one or two good songs, but he never sort of recaptured the brilliance of this album. Do you subscribe to that train of thought?
I do. I do. One of my favorite George Harrison albums is, and I have to admit there are a couple that I don't know very much about. I got into a conversation with Stephen Schnee about extra texture, and he hates that. And I listened to it, and I was kind of like, oh, I don't know, it's
I
kind of
don't
all
mind that
right.
album.
Yeah, I think it's all right. But my favorite out of all of his, except for this early stuff, was always self-titled. I think that the 1980 George Harrison album I thought was one of his better albums from the period where his albums weren't so good. I think that's the best one of that batch. But again, just a pleasant album. Not good like This Is Good. Like All Things Must Pass
Mm.
is good. But
I think Living in the Material World had its moments,
I do
and
too.
that was like the last breath of kind of three quarters of the album being of high quality. But
Yeah.
that middle period in the 70s, there was definitely a bit of a drop off. But I don't mind extra texture. I think that was fine. Did you
I
like the
haven't
Jeff?
spent a lot of time with it, so
Yeah,
I'm gonna try to pick it up and get all the way through it and see what
yeah.
I think of it. But
And then he was the Renaissance man in the 80s. Like so many
yes,
middle aged rockers had their sort of renaissance in the 80s. And he was another one, with the Traveling Wilburys and the album that he put together with Jeff Lynne producing, Living in a Material. No, what was it? The
Cloud
Cloud
Nine.
Nine. Cloud
Yeah.
Nine, yeah. Which was nice. It was built for the times and it did fabulously well. It was a huge hit in the States, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes. Enormous. Yeah. It's to my chagrin too, because I wanted Jeff Lynne to make more ELO records, but they were having a tough time. And so when this thing happened with Harrison, he really just kind of dove into that between that and the Wilburys. And I always thought I really wish Jeff Lynne had more time to make ELO records, but the Harrison stuff and the Traveling Wilbury stuff is very good, so I shouldn't complain. I agree. I feel like after the I feel like Somewhere in England is okay, not as good as George Harrison, and then I
Oh,
feel
I mean,
like
it only had
Gone,
all those years ago was the
yeah,
song,
I
and
feel like
I've
Gone Troppo isn't very good,
no,
and
that
so
that wasn't very good. But all
yeah,
that song somewhere in England, I felt like a lot of that was rushed out because of you know the passing of John Lennon, the tragic death
yeah,
of John
and
Lennon,
he
and
actually turned that album in, and it got get handed back to him.
yeah,
To
so
keep working on this.
so
So
he had to quickly whip out that song, which
yeah,
went number one all around the world. But I
yeah.
think it was more off the back of the John Lennon incident.
But
But
I think if he'd have just done what he wanted to do at that point,
mm,
I would have rather have heard that.
yep,
But I
yep,
always say that whenever record companies get involved and say,
yep,
"Come back with three more songs." I always think, "No, just
yep,
let us hear it how it is."
yeah, yeah. One more thing, just to wrap up this show. There's a certain artist that is sort of lingering in George Harrison's career, and to me, I think George has always looked up to this particular artist, and he actually covered one of his songs. And I'm talking about Bob Dylan.
Yeah, I figured you probably were.
If not for you, I think that's a wonderful version, and it's got
I
that
do
wonderful,
too.
soulful, spiritual version of the song. I
I
think it's
almost picked it to highlight, but
yeah, I
I
think it's a
kind of
highlight.
feel like of the two songs, well, I'd Have You Anytime is a collaboration.
Mm,
And so I feel like that sounds as much like a Dylan song as it sounds like a George Harrison song. But if
yep.
not for you, sounds like a Dylan song. It sounds like Harrison is just covering it.
I actually prefer it to the Dylan version.
Yeah, I think I do too.
Yeah.
I think I do too. But it's very true to Bob Dylan's style, I think.
But I think that the two folks that have had the outside the Beatles that have had the biggest influence on Harrison is probably Clapton and
Mhm.
Dylan. And I just have a lot of, I just think a lot of Bob Dylan on this album for some reason. The lyricism, the thought, the arrangements. I don't know.
Yeah, I do too. Real quick, I wanted to ask you what you thought of Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp because I don't care for that song.
Humor.
Yeah,
It's
I
got that
think
offbeat sort of English humor. Yeah,
yeah,
it's
I think
probably
it's okay.
the weakest.
They picked it as a track to put on that Let It Roll compilation, which I think is odd. I would have
Yep.
picked something better, but
Yeah.
it's not bad. But it that's one of the ones that stands out as being okay. Well, if I have to pick the song I like the least, it's either
Yep.
Apple Scruffs or that. But again, Apple Scruffs humor.
Yeah. It's
He's
got a.
talking about the people that hang out around the studio to catch a glimpse of him, and that's
Yep.
kind of cool. Before we
Yep.
wrap up, just in case we
Yep.
don't have enough time, it took me a long time. I listened to this record a couple of times a week for about a month, and I really it was a really slow burn for me. I thought, oh, there's too much sameness. There's no
Mm.
clarity in the mix. And then I heard we haven't talked about it yet, but I heard Apple Jams, which I think is absolutely terrible. Um, I was talking to Steve Snee. I was telling him I was going to do this show last night, and I mentioned, I said, "What do you think of All Things Must Pass?" And he said, I think Apple Jam ruins it." And I said, "Really? You can't just separate it?" Because I just separate it. I just don't consider it part of this album. But he was like, "No, if he says it's part of the album, then it tanks the album for me," which I think is harsh, but an interesting observation.
Yeah, I love it. I love the
But
looseness.
I really don't care for it. But
Yeah, I
I
love the looseness
usually
of it.
don't care for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, well, that's what I said. It was very much like the jam rock was so in vogue in the early 70s, and it's just picking up on that where you just got all these superstar friends in the studio and just putting on a show and just seeing where it leads. So I don't mind it at all. But look, I've heard that theory, but I love
I
this
don't agree
album.
with it. I think it's very easy to separate it, which is what
Yeah,
I do.
yeah. So
The last song is Hear Me, Lord. The rest is just bonus gravy.
all right, so what's your final view of this album? Where do you think this sits?
Well, I think that because of what a slow burn it was and how much it's grown on me, I think it's definitely his best album, his best solo album. I think up till that point, it's the best Beatles solo album. It's definitely in the upper echelon, even when you take into consideration everyone's later albums. But I think uh, once you get to Band on the Run, that's where the scale sort of tips, and at that point, I think Lennon is also making strong albums, and I think Ringo's making decent albums. Who would have thought during the days of the Beatles that Ringo would make decent solo albums? But he made a few. So
He did in that early 70s period, really
yeah,
strong albums. But look, I'll stick to it. I just think this is the greatest Beatles solo album. But that's all part of the fun of
it's a
our
contender
world.
for me.
Yeah, it's right up there.
I'm not quite ready to commit to that yet, but I'm that
Yeah,
may happen.
but I think this is a masterpiece, and it's just you've got one guy that's just been suppressing all this musicology and all this um, wonderful songs, and it just explodes, and all in one album. And yeah, I just think it's great. Well, thank you, Todd, as always.
Sure.
Todd and I
This
know
was a
about
very rewarding exercise.
oh,
I appreciate it.
always
Thank you.
always great to have you on the show. And I'll tell you, folks, Todd and I have got a show coming up that's going to blow your mind. But we'll keep this a secret. Zip.
It's going to be fun.
But something to do in this sort of wheelhouse. So just watch this space. Please check out Todd on the Contrarians, actually just put Todd Evans YouTube. You'll see a plethora of fantastic shows.
Okay.
Please like and subscribe to Rock Daydream Nation. Tell us what you think of this album. Tell us what you think of your favorite Beatles solo album. I'm sure that there's going to be some pros and cons, but hey, it's only just our views, and that's what life's all about. Different opinions. But one thing's for sure, you'll see Todd and I doing much more shows on Rock Daydream Nation in 2024. Check us out. See you later.